We continue now at the top of Daf Kuf Samech Gimel Amud Aleph and Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 163a. On the previous summit, the Gemara said that if you have two blank lines between the text of a document and the signature, that disqualifies the document. And the Gemara now asks, when we talk about these two blank lines, Hein va'aviron, does that mean the lines themselves and their airspace? Odilma, or maybe Hein v'lo aviron, maybe it means them, but not counting their airspace, even a little less, is able to disqualify the document. And the Rashbam explains, Hein va'aviron means to say, Shir ksivas hashit, and it means the measurement, the amount of the actual writing of the lines, va'avir cholak bein time, and then there's a little blank space between the lines. Nifsal, is that what's needed to disqualify the document? Avol pachos mikan eino nifsal, but if it's less than that, then it's not disqualified, or maybe no, as long as it's two lines of just the writing, that's enough. If it's those two blank lines, that's enough to disqualify the document. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Mistabra, it makes sense to say Dehein va'aviron. It makes sense to say that we're talking about the lines and also the space between the lines. The Isal Gadaita Hein v'lo aviron, because if it should enter your mind that we mean the lines alone are enough to disqualify even without the space between them. So Shita Achas below Avir, if you just have one line without that space, Lamai Chazi, what does it fit for? Elashma Mina, rather, we see from here, Hein v'avir, and we see that it's them and the space between. Shma Mina, and the Gemara says, indeed, we see that that is the case. And the Rashbam explains, Hachi Garsin, and the proper text is, the Isal Gadaitach, if it should enter your mind, Hein v'lo avir, and them without the space between them, Lamai Chazi, what does it fit for? It seems the Rashbam does not have the words Shita Achas below Avira in his text of the Gemara. In any case, the Rashbam explains, V'halo Nikar Hazif, if that's all there was that was left blank, so then it would be clear that there was a forgery. L'fi shetzarech lichtov osios dakos yoser, mishar osios ashtar, because it's such a narrow amount of space, you would have to write smaller letters than the rest of the letters in the document, kedei losses cholak bein shita l'shita, in order to have a little bit of blank space between the lines. V'im yichtov ksiva gas, and if you're going to write large letters, gamaton nikar hazif, then also it's going to be clear that there was a forgery, shein cholak bein time, because people are going to see that there's no blank space between the lines, kishar shitas shavishtar, like the rest of the lines of the shtar. In other words, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak is saying, if you're going to have two lines, but you're not going to have a little bit of that extra space between the lines, so then if someone tries to forge on the document, it will be obvious, and so therefore you see, obviously, the only disqualification is if there's the amount of space of two lines plus the space that's between those lines. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Shabti Omar Mishmei de Chizkiya. Rabbi Shabti says in the name of Chizkiya, Shnei Shitin Shamru, again, when we're talking about these two lines of blank space that disqualify the document, that's only B'chsav Yedei Edom. That's when you measure the writing according to the way that witnesses write. Witnesses write in larger letters. They're not experts at writing. V'lo Ksav Yedei Sofer. We're not going by the way the Sofer writes, by the way the scribe writes, because the Sofer is able to write very small letters. And here again, we're talking about a forgery that's done by a regular person. A person is not going to go to a scribe in order to forge, as the Gemara now says, my time, and what's the reason? The cholam mizayif, because anyone who's forging on a document, lav lagabe safra ozul mizayif, he doesn't go to a scribe, he doesn't go to a sofer in order to forge, he's going to write it in himself, and so therefore it has to be enough space for the average person who would try to write something in. That's the disqualification. And the Gemara continues, v'kam, and how much space exactly is needed for this disqualification? And the Gemara answers, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar. Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar says, Kagon l'cha, zeh al gabe zeh. It has to be enough space that the words l'cha can go on top of each other, one on top of another, meaning to say, the word l'cha, so the lamed is tall, it goes up high, and the chaf, that's long towards the bottom, and so therefore if you have to stack those words one on top of the other, that's a little bit of extra space there. That's the amount of space you need for the shtar to be disqualified, because that's what is needed if the person would try to forge anything on the document. And the Gemara continues, Alma, so we see from this opinion, Kasavar, that he holds Shnei Shitin v'arbo avir, and it essentially comes out to two lines and four avirin, which is again these spaces between the lines. When we say four, the idea again is because you have the top of the lamed, that's one, then you have the bottom of that top chaf, so that's the second space that's needed, and then the top of the second lamed in l'cha, that's the third space that's needed, and then the bottom of the chaf of the second l'cha, that is the fourth space that is needed. And the Gemara continues, Rav Chia bar Ami mishmei de Ula, and Rav Chia bar Ami says in the name of Ula, could go in lamed milmala v'chaf milmata. It just needs to be a lamed on the top and a chaf on the bottom. In other words, it's not that you're stacking l'cha on top of the word l'cha, it's just that extra space of the lamed on the top top line and the extra space from the chaf on the bottom line. And so the Gemara says, Alma, we see from this understanding, Kasavar, that he holds, Shnei Shitin Ushlosha Avirin, that it's going to be 2 lines and 3 spaces between the lines. And the Rashbam explains, Ushlosha Avirin, you need 3 spaces, meaning Debein Shnei Hashitim, because according to this opinion, between the 2 lines, Dailonu Ba'avir Echad, it's enough for just 1 space. You don't have to have enough space for the bottom of the chaf and the top of the lamed. You just need to have enough space for one of those. Sheyachu la'amin es yada laharchik rosh halamed tachtona mikeneged regel chaf elyon. The person who's writing, who's forging, is able to arrange things that the top of that bottom lamed is not going to be exactly opposite the bottom of that upper chaf, and so therefore it's enough just to have that 1 space between the lines. That's why it's a total of 3 spaces. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Yavo says, Kagon Baruch ben Levi b'shita achas, the amount of space that causes a disqualification is that a person is able to write the words Baruch ben Levi on 1 line. The idea is that the chaf again goes a little below and the lamed goes a little above. Kasavar, because he holds shita achas ushnei avir, and just 1 line with 2 spaces, 1 a little above, 1 space a little below, that's enough to disqualify the document. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav says, Lo shanu ela bein edim l'chsav. This entire discussion about 2 lines disqualifying the document, if you have 2 blank lines between the text and the witnesses, that's only true when we're talking about the space between the witnesses again and the text. Avol bein edim li'asharta, but in terms of the space between the signature of the witnesses and the asharta is also called the henpik. That's the judges who sign when they certify a document. So let's say you have space between the signatures of the witnesses and the signatures of the judges, afilu tuvanami kosher. Even if there's a lot of space, it is still going to be kosher according to Rav. And the Gemara says, Ma'ishna ben edim l'chsav dilma mezayef v'chosav my deboy. What's the difference that the space between the signature of the witnesses and the text of the document, we're afraid he's going to forge, he's going to write whatever he wants, v'chasimi sahadi, and then he'll have these signatures of the witnesses. It should be the same concern, ben edim la'asharta nami. When it comes to the space between the witnesses and the signatures of the judges, it's the same concern. Mezayef v'chosav my deboy. He's going to forge and write whatever he wants. V'chasimi sahadi, and then he'll just sign some witnesses, and now those witnesses will automatically be certified by the signatures of the judges. And the Gemara continues and answers, the reason we're not concerned when you have space between the signature of the witnesses and the signature of the judges is because metayetle means to say there's some ink, there's either dots of ink or lines of ink that are between the signature of the judges and the signature of the witnesses, so it's impossible to write anything in that area, and that's why that is not a concern. But the Gemara says, if that's the case, so ben edim l'shtar nami, between the signature of the witnesses and the text of the document as well, metayetle, just put in some ink over there, and then you won't be able to write things in, and it shouldn't be a concern over there either. Why are we making a distinction between the space between the signature of the witnesses and the judges and the space between the signature of the witnesses and the text? It should be the same thing if you've inked in that area. And the Gemara answers, Amri, people will say the reason why you can't put ink in that area by the case of the space between the text and the witnesses is because people might say, that the witnesses, maybe they didn't even sign the document. That wouldn't be a kosher document because it could be the witnesses are just signing that there was some ink placed here and that there was nothing that was done in terms of trying to cover something up in this document, so therefore such a document wouldn't be good. But the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, ben edim la'ashar tanami, in the space between the signature of the witnesses and the signature of the judges as well, Amri, won't people say, beidina atiyutahu techasimi, that the court is just signing on the fact that there was ink on this part of the document? And the Gemara answers to that, Beidina atiyuta lo chasimi, a court would never sign just on the fact that there was some ink on a document, and therefore that's not a concern in terms of the space between the signature of the witnesses and the signature of the judges, but it would be a concern in terms of the space between the text itself and the signature of the witnesses. But the Gemara continues, V'leichush, but we should still be concerned in a situation, again, where you have space between the signature of the witnesses and the signature of the judges, and you've put ink in that space. We should still be concerned. Dil magayiz leila, maybe he'll cut off the top of the document, umachik leilatiyuta, and then he'll erase that ink. V'chasav ma'idabay, he'll write whatever he wants. Umachsim sahadi, and sign witnesses over there. And then we have the signature of the judges, and people will think that this is a certified document. V'yamar Rav, and Rav says, shtar habohu ve'edav ala mechak, that anytime you have a document where both the actual text and the signature of the witnesses is written on something that was erased, kosher, that's actually kosher, and so therefore we should be concerned about that in this situation where you have space between the signature of the witnesses and the signature of the judges, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Gimel Amid Beis.